morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our closing plenary of this year's annual meeting. We have with us this morning our rapporteur, Jim Schiro, as well as our 4 co-chairs for the annual meeting. And what we will attempt to do over the next 60 minutes is to bring the over 250 working sessions that we've had during these days, plus the numerous other working sessions that we've had on a private scale, all to a movement forward. What are the expectations that we can go back from the annual meeting? What are the main conclusions that we have drawn here? And what are big action areas or action points that we should try to aggregate ourselves around as we move out into the year? Philippe, maybe you will please start us out. I always like to start out these when we're together with my better half.
Thank you, José, María. I will just take 3 points which I think were clearly are not exhaustive of all the discussions, but 3 points which I think were salient issues. First one is on corporations. I will start with that, and the question as to whether companies should focus on short-term or on long-term value creation. And clearly here, there was some level of consensus that, fortunately or unfortunately, companies have to do both. In other words, hit short-term targets as well as create long-term value for their shareholders. So this will require probably a few adjustments. One in executive compensation, which would reflect it, evolve some management methods, as well as, and that's interesting, reconciliate psychology, which is very important for short-term, including in communication, but also surely economic fundamentals for the long term. Second salient fact is corporate social responsibility. We've been discussing about this subject for now a number of annual meetings, but it's becoming more and more important. At a time where companies are getting much more global, they are more detached from local communities. A long time ago, when NCR was located in Dayton, Ohio, they had a lot of responsibilities in the local community, library, schools, museums, and so on, and same with Michelin in France, in Clermont-Ferrand. Today, decisions are not taken at the local level. Companies are much more global, and therefore the notion of global corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, is becoming of utmost importance. Then, and this will be my last point, because I think it has been omnipresent in all of discussions, is the new, probably one of the most challenging issues in the agenda for the next year or next few years, is the question of outsourcing. By the way, a lot of words are used: outsourcing, world sourcing. Outsourcing could be outsourcing to an outside vendor, but it could be also outsourcing your own jobs in a different country. And this happens at a time where the debate on, for instance, agricultural subsidies in the trade negotiations is not yet resolved. So when you add the two things together, the complexity of the outsourcing issues for let's say in the United States, in Europe, outsourcing jobs to India, China, now Brazil, South Africa, and so on, at the same time as we are not yet, at least, able to deal with the agricultural subsidies issue, will be very difficult. And one of the reasons is that the public sector is working on one clock, and the private sector is moving a little faster on a different clock. So my question to my half, who knows politics very well, is how can we reconcile the two clocks?
Well, that was in my previous life, but nevertheless, I'll still move on to that. And I think that in this issue of reconciling clocks here, there are some aspects that we should really go away from this annual meeting reflecting upon how we can solve these issues. And perhaps our co-chairs would also like to address this in their comments that we'll go to in a couple of minutes. President Clinton said here on the first day that we know what needs to be done. We have very good examples of what has to be done in many areas, but we need a systemic approach. We need to be able to scale up, replicate, to the point where it really makes a great difference and an impact. And this is John, you were mentioning very much along the same lines when we had our session on the Jordan Educational Initiative. This is a great initiative. It's going very well. How do we move beyond that initiative? How do we scale and replicate so that we do have a lot more impact? President Wolfenson of the World Bank said on the first day, we know what needs to be done, but we're not giving it the necessary resources for it to get done. In other words, we're not sourcing the solutions that we have at hand in a way where we could get massive impact out of them. And here at the forum, we presented in this annual meeting our global governance report, on which over 40 multidisciplinary experts have been working on during the last year, giving us global society, a grade on how we're doing with respect to solving the Millennium Development Goals of the UN Declaration, and the scorecard we got as a global society is 3 out of 10. So those 3 are a confirmation that as a global society, the clocks are not ticking in the same way. We really need to address that. I'm sure that our co-chairs will speak to that, and you may also wish to speak to that when we open it up. But let me go to Jim Schiro. What are your conclusions?
So my task at hand here, and you've heard this, 250 working sessions, 96 hours of interaction, discussion of these issues over the last several days. I spent with a group starting yesterday an hour and then an hour today to distill all of this down to 4 minutes so we can get to these issues. And I think José María has done a very good job just now describing some of this, but I'm going to take you through the framework of partnering for risk and prosperity and really boil it down to 3 broad questions that I would pose to the co-chairs to react to. One is really, what are the new risks to security and prosperity, and have these risks and issues really just been reframed? Has the perception of security and prosperity really changed when you look at it today? And are there new tools to anticipate and manage these new challenges? So let me talk a little bit about these perceived new or reframed risks. And I would say, as you look back, there's really, is it a new risk, or are we just having a misperception of what the risk is? If you think about it, those of you who may have attended these meetings back in the late 90s and even into early 2000, were we really seeing the risk that lied ahead? If you think about our expectations during that era of technological revolution and how we have now found the code to prosperity forever during that period of time as a result of technology. And we probably missed really assessing a lot of the risks that were there and realizing and always focusing on that, entrepreneurial risk and the fact that risk exists is the key to progress, is the key to prosperity, and we can't lose sight of the fact. It's the way in which we manage risks. Also focus on the impact that technology and the way we've dealt with issues, and this new dimension that we face of risks and the catastrophic outcomes that come from the way we've reordered the world, from the way we deal with it, and the systemic nature of some of these risks. So you go back to the summer and you have a breakdown in the power grid in the US, and the rest of the world watches, doesn't really understand it, but really talks about the phenomenon of the US, and this can happen here, only there. And shortly thereafter, there's a breakdown of the power grid in Europe. Preparing for those kinds of catastrophic risks, understanding the interaction, then also look at the environmental risks that we're seeing and the resulting environmental catastrophes. Large floods, devastating winter storms, hurricanes, And the answer is climatic changes, global warming. We've always had these kinds of catastrophes. It's the buildup of population in progress. When you have the same intensity of a hurricane on a desert or deserted island versus that same hurricane hitting southern Florida or a highly populated area and the economic cost of that. Are we managing and anticipating those risks in a different order? And also, one has to look at and can't ignore the spread of diseases and the whole biotech issues and how we deal with those. If you look at the perceptions of security now, this next order, and the prosperity and how these perceptions have changed. It's fair to say that when you're in a downturn in an economy or you're in a bottom part, the one thing in every institution that you have to look at is the lack of trust, the loss of credibility. And that in the environment as you've discussed it is a lack of trust in governments, corporations, experts, and others that interact. You can't point the finger at the other person when you look at the state of the world today based on the feedback we've come. I think there is a shared responsibility, and yes, I think the media has to look at the role it plays in this evolving process. A role of the media from a print media to perhaps what some would say is an entertainment news media and the impact of how some of those issues get reported. Those are all talked about and really focused on over the last 96 hours. But let's make sure that we don't lose sight of the changing perception of risk and the possibility that this changing perception of risk gets us to be so risk adverse that we lose a very, very important factor of thought leadership. When you are trying to deal with issues on your back feet as opposed to being out in front with a degree of confidence. And I think one of the messages as you leave here is, yes, I think people feel much better about the economy than we did a year ago, and we feel much better about where we're going. But as we look at risk and prosperity, we have to make sure we balance the two. New tools to anticipate and manage risks. I think it was said we do need more systematic and more systemic thinking that is aware of the many facets and the interconnectedness. Just like the power grid and just like the interconnectedness, are we anticipating as we develop these new and better ways to manage ourselves? We need to get to the focus of back to more scenario planning and more stress testing of how we manage ourselves. And we have to get better quantitative and qualitative tools to improve risk assessments as we go forward. And let's make sure we have the right competencies, both in politics and businesses and in NGOs. The right leaders. Most of us who are leading today came up in a different era. We use this technology in a very labored way, not in an instinctive way. And if you look at your children and the younger people, they use this technology and development in a much more instinctive way and will be better able to manage the risks in the future. Right measures and developments that may improve risks, some cautions, the unintended consequences of regulation. In the aftermath of corporate scandals, we rush into regulation. They do not basically eliminate the risks. I take you back to the original 10 Commandments, the original rules, and we're still writing rules on top of rules. Bad people make bad decisions. Let's look at the values of the people that we have and focus on that. Increased transparency, the thirst and request for more and more information. It's how we use that information. The mindful requests for disclosures can be stifling and crippling as we go forward. And the advances of technology just feed into that as we can get more and more information. So let's summarize what you've all said from the standpoint of the challenge for partnering for prosperity and security. We have to ensure that the major stakeholders, both the private and public sector and the NGOs, work together in a civil society and understand the interconnectivity of that and understand the dialogue that's required. Just like NCR back in the Dayton days and the obligations that one has. I just think that the village has gotten to be a lot bigger from that standpoint. And when you look at the issue of outsourcing, for example, it is really a migrating workforce issue, just like the migration of agricultural workers to the cities during the Industrial Revolution. You now have a global migration of jobs, and how we manage that on a global scale with the right tools. And one last thing as we talk about leaders. Leaders have to be accountable to deliver results and make tough decisions, but they have to make sure that they speak the truth and have the courage and conviction to make the tough decisions, even unpopular policies. It's not the not in my time in office syndrome that we need and postpone the tough decisions until after the re-election campaign. We have to become increasingly results-driven as we go forward. And in the end, I would just leave us with this last thought. Ethical behavior cannot be legislated. It cannot be imposed by regulation. The most important thing we can do in society and in forums like this is acknowledge the right behavior and reward it.
Jim, thank you very much for a very good, comprehensive wrap-up. Just slightly over 4 minutes, but still very comprehensive and good. Thank you. Let's go now to our co-chairs for their reactions on what Jim has summed up as an important part. John, let's start with you, please.
Sure. In fact, combining the comments that Philippe made and also Jim, we want to solve these problems one variable at a time, and it doesn't work that way. It is a complex equation, and we've got to understand when we make a change to one variable within the equation, we have to understand you have to make changes to the others. So let me use a case in point for the three things that José María, you mentioned and Philippe mentioned. Corporate responsibility, government and business moving at the same pace, not in different paces, and President Clinton's comments about scalable type of opportunities and process, and use the Jordanian Education Initiative as an example. One of the things that becomes obvious on corporate responsibility is for each of us as businesses or NGOs or government or academia to make a difference, we should stay in the area that we really understand and say, how do we add value to that? When we get dramatically out of our area, often you don't get the systemic capability to scale it. So when you look at the Jordanian Education Initiative as an example, people focused on networking that had that experience, on e-learning that had that experience, on focus about computers, where did they go in, and by working together as a group, it came together, and we had the expertise on it. But it was so important that all the groups move at the same pace. If you use the usual approach, the government moves slower than the businesses, or the businesses move slower than the NGOs, you don't get the desired results. And so the ability to keep the whole group moving at the same pace was very, very key. And then to realistically look at the potential outcomes of it and say, can we do it for one country, and then will it scale across other countries? And I think that's one of the examples that we learned an awful lot this last year about as a group with help from World Economic Forum and others. But the point that I'm making, it doesn't work by just doing one of the variables well. You have to do multiple together to pull them together.
Thank you very much. Now, Carlos probably have also a few remarks.
Well, it's just to try to be very specific and close on one particular issue which came back into different debates, was about the leadership and the lack of trust that exists today and the lack of credibility. Well, in a certain way, it's good that when you take a leadership position that there is some kind of lack of trust. I think it's good. I think in a certain way you don't help leadership when you start and people trust you because you didn't do anything yet. So if starting in a leadership position there is not some doubt about you, it doesn't in a certain way don't put you from the beginning in the situation where you should be, which means you owe transparency and you owe results. This is the tool. What's transparency? Transparency is very simple. What are you going to do today? What are you going to do tomorrow? Very simple. What are the priorities? What you want to achieve? The way you see your mission. And I'm talking about only business people. I'm talking about political leaders. I'm talking about any kind of responsibility of management, whether you're managing news, expertise, companies, or association. Transparency is extremely important. And transparency is not only something which is abstract. It's something which is translated into very specific steps. What are you going to do today? What are you going to do tomorrow? And the tomorrow depends on how much time is your tenure. You know, are you staying 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? What's the program? And second, and probably the most important thing, that's why people need leaders. If not, there is no need for leadership. It's deliver. Deliver the results that you have committed to, which from time to time can be the one that people are expecting, or more or less. But what's very important is deliver on the commitment. And you know, every single crisis of trust, of lack of credibility, you can bring it back to these two notions: lack of transparency or lack of results. People trying to, you know, play games, forgetting. You can see it everywhere. People spending more time explaining why they failed instead of spending time to explain how they're going to succeed. This kind of situation becomes more and more unacceptable. That means in the society, on the 21st century, people are expecting transparency and results. It came very well in your comments. I think we can illustrate it in every single country in the world. You can take as many examples in business as you can take examples in politics. And I think this is something which came through the discussion, and it's very important that we keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Also, I know that Marilyn has, I'm sure, a lot of comments.
My comments have been stimulated this morning by your discussion of the need for a new framework and a little bit about risk. We talked about the new risks to security and prosperity. I'm not sure that it's a new risk, but clearly to me, it is a risk that we not be inclusive in our framework. And it may seem like an obvious thing to hear from me, but perhaps in this environment, not so obvious, that really one of the major stakeholders whose voices are not sufficiently at the table is the voice of women. Now, why do I consider this a risk? I consider it a risk to corporations' ability to compete, because increasingly we're in a global battle for talent, and we're at risk that we don't draw from the entire talent pool. I consider it a risk in a world that is becoming closer to one-to-one and customer relationship management, that we lose touch with the consumer if we fail to acknowledge that 80% of the consumption in the United States is done by women. It's a risk that as we enter an internet world, that we fail to observe that last year the number of women who were using the internet, perhaps because of their ability to do purchasing as well as educate themselves in real time, has surpassed the usage by men in the United States. And I think it's a big risk not to acknowledge that empowering women in developing countries is actually 4 times more likely to impact the health of those countries and the education of the children. The World Bank has indeed decided that gender equity must be one of the imperatives for development if we're going to accomplish the improved state of the world that we are all here to identify. And of course, in HIV/AIDS, perhaps we need a differentiated approach. I'm not certain that looking at it without differentiating the fact that 55% of the people who've died in Africa of AIDS are women, and that perhaps as we approach that problem, their issues are slightly different. It's really an and world, isn't it? Short-term and long-term. Taking care of our own communities and our own families and being citizens of the global marketplace. We do need a new framework, because without that, we can't include everyone in the partnerships and leverage our time and our energy and our skills on behalf of the greater whole.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Walter?
Well, I would like to make 3 short observations on some aspects of this risk menu Jim has presented. He has mentioned this example of the power grid in America and the power grid failures afterwards also in Europe. A power grid is, for me, like an example for the interconnection, the interdependency. We are building huge quasi-power grids in the world with international global supply chains and with outsourcing. And that increases the risk enormously, in particular because it's combined with a just-in-time mentality. Somebody said during the meeting that we should, giving this interconnectivity and this interdependency, go from a just-in-time mentality to a just-in-case mentality and build deliberately redundancies into the system to cope with the unpredictable and the unexpected, which will happen anyway. So that's maybe one observation. The other observation is that in particular in societies which have now behind themselves 60, 80, 100 years of uninterrupted growth and prosperity, no wars on their territories, there has developed a all-risk insurance mentality, and I think it's wrong. It also is the wrong expectation from our politicians, it's the wrong expectations from business that there is no risk out there, that you can handle it, so that it's absolutely plannable what is going to happen, that it is without disruption what is the future will bring you is foreseeable. Despite the fact that this is completely boring, of course, in addition, it's an illusion. And I think we should, and that's my third small observation, I have sometimes the impression that the reaction to regulate is nothing than to try and figure out, is there a all-risk insurance solution to everything that happens? And I don't think it is. There are several ways to regulate. Either we build up a huge bureaucracy. It won't make decisions better, it will make them more difficult. And it will make them just longer. And the other one is disclosure. And if I look how disclosure has increased in all kinds, disclosure of your numbers, risk, disclosure of what you do besides your job, what your relatives do, as a disclosure of all kinds of information, which you think will make decision-making by investors or by the public at large much better. Ultimately, when you combine that all, I think it adds to a huge confusion, because the complexity is not going to go away with disclosure. And the disclosure comes to such huge amounts of additional information that I sometimes have the problem whether interpretation of additional disclosure or transparency in any way can follow the number of can be followed by interpretation and understanding of what is going on. So maybe these three remarks about risk.
Thank you very much. So you've all brought up different angles of what Jim reported on, and I was wondering if you may want to make a comment with respect to what one of your other colleagues as co-chairs have made. John, would you pick up?
Sure.
Yes.
I'm going to go with Marilyn's topic, and I think it is so easy when we deal with a topic like gender to always look to another country or another company rather than looking at home first. And during this week, as I watched, I began to realize that while we do very well versus our peers on the gender issue, we are not doing an acceptable level. So I think often when we deal with these issues, we start with our own companies. And we start with the World Economic Forum as well, when we put the topics on the agenda. And also if we have people talking about the importance of gender, it shouldn't be all women talking about the importance of gender. We ought to have a good mix in it. So I think very often starting ourselves as well as focusing on the global issues is very key.
So we need to make note of that. José María.
I made several notes this week. My team reminded me.
Did I hear you commit to making note of that? That's great, because what we can do in the sense of, I think that Klaus's admonition when we came here, whether people came as the corporate or political or civil society leader or came as a partner, was how to engage personally wherever we are. And I think that's absolutely the key, and I think John's point is correct. But I also like the frameworks that the partnerships and turnabout is fair play. John's reference to the initiative that they've taken on with the schools in Jordan. I think it's very exciting that the Economic Forum is allowing us, either with our corporate skills and expertise or with our philanthropic, either one, to find ways to partner with NGOs and governments to really collectively solve the problem, so that we can do it in an efficient way and leverage the resource. Because everything, whether we all know in our own companies, we build redundancy, it's costly. I mean, the things we're talking about here are expensive. So we've got to find ways to actually leverage and get the greatest possible value out of our human as well as our financial resource across the world.
You know, staying on a point just for a second, one of the mistakes we all make on corporate social responsibility and giving is if you talk to a lot of the people behind the scenes and you ask, did you really make a difference? Many people would say it was a nice program, but no, it didn't really make a difference or scale. And I think it's one of the things that the World Economic Forum both can do and is doing is to create an environment that has the capability for people to come together and say, I can give resources, I can give people, I can give money, I can give expertise in networking, I can give expertise in my planes that can fly into natural disasters. But there's no vehicle other than the World Economic Forum that I'm aware of that creates both the environment, the dialogue, and the constructing those. So going back to building a process, so we don't reinvent the process each time, take the Jordan Education Initiative, what really allowed it to scale, how do we do it, and to begin to think how we create that environment so when things occur at a faster and faster pace around the world, how do we move with governments, NGOs, academia, and business together?
Jose, can I just add something to this and maybe ask some of the other panelists to consider this? And it's the whole issue of not just gender but diversity. And one of the things that the forum does is bring basically three diverse groups together to discuss issues: business leaders, political leaders, and the NGOs. And we have to look at this agenda, and some of what I've heard from some of the people who I've talked to in preparing some of this, were we engaging those groups in a very interactive way together, or were we siloing that information as we brought it together? And that is, are the business people meeting here discussing the issue, and the politicians and perhaps the NGOs meeting here, and we're not intermingling those discussions sufficiently to get that diversity of thought?
I have a little question to both Walter and Jim on risk, which you have elaborated on. Do you think that a positive way to look at risk is to not to talk about managing risks, whether it's in politics, whether it's in corporations and everywhere, and talk about managing fragility? Because what we have emphasized is that the world is more fragile today. That's all. Fragility, there are a few places of tension in the world. Fragility of the electrical grids, but also the IT networks, and a number of things. And I think one positive approach would be, to get organized, to manage in a fragile world, rather than a negative way to just manage crisis. Just a question.
Well, I think, first of all, there are long-term shifts in risk profiles. And the natural way to deal with that has always been adaptation. And I think we should not forget that climate change and things like that, it's adaptation which ultimately is managing these risks. We have had, with the long time of prosperity and the long capital stock buildup which we had in the world, investments, physical capital stock has been built in areas which have been very risky. Florida, earthquake-prone zones and all over the world have taken risk on, and that is, in a way, if you look at it, it's not adaptation. It's sort of saying, no, we can handle that. We build up additional risk into the system because our technology can deal with that. That's another strategy. So there are both strategy: adaptation, which also means stepping back and managing fragility, also lowering the fragility of the system, and on the other hand, develop technologies which allow them maybe to go back in. I think, from my perspective, in the long run, adaptation in this kind of thing is the best risk management, and not compensation for damage suffered. Compensation for damage suffered is the last resort you have to have. You want to avoid damage.
This is an issue, obviously, because of our businesses, at least historically, before Walter shifted to banking, that we interacted with a lot. And the question, if you look at companies like ours, was really anticipating risk, the modeling that we would do from the 100-year flood. The unfortunate thing is when you have 200-year floods, one year right after the other, but you may not have another for 200 years. What's changed is what I think you've heard here is trying to anticipate the the electrical grid and the unintended consequences of the electrical grid and adapting, as we say, for that.
I'd like to kind of combine the two, the thought about leadership of Carlos and the fact that delivering results is ultimately the test of leadership, and the question of risk, because it's hard to expect long-term stewardship from short-term stewards. And in the United States, we had, I think, between 98 and 2001, 30% of the CEOs turned over. And I think in 1 year subsequent to that, it was almost half of that. So we talk about being the rhythm between the political sector and the business sector. The political sector maybe in different countries has a different rhythm. It may be 4 years, it may be a different cycle. But we're going to have to address that question, because we do want results, and leaders do need to deliver results, Carlos. But the question is, in what time frame? And how can you change a culture in a year or 2 years? Or I think the average lifespan now of a corporate CEO in America is somewhere between 3 and 5 years. Anyone who's stepped in to lead a company knows you cannot change the culture overnight. And some people have ultimately changed the numbers instead.
Yes, Walter?
Carlos?
I might just add quickly here one thing. It has been mentioned by Jim. It's the impact of the media. And I know that media bashing is the most popular thing to do on a panel. It helps you really. But I'm not going to media bash. I just say that the media has taken away the focus from the institution to the individual. Why? The electronic media cannot report about an institution. It has to report about a human being who gives an interview, or can be blamed, or can be heard, or whatever it is. And that brings this short-term view, because the institution, in a way, large companies, parties, whatever you have, are stepping somehow back, and the emphasis isn't completely on the fellow, or on the woman, of course, who is in the limelight for 3 years, and then he's, with a big bang, is dropped, and then a new guy is there, and his view is short-termism. Has to be.
Maybe just picking up a little bit different topic that I hear coming up, the importance of government and business moving at the same pace. And again, going back to the equation analysis, you've got to understand when you make decisions on one area the effect it has on others. People would say, well, outsourcing, an example, is just something that happened from an agricultural community to an industrial revolution, or it's something that happened in the manufacturing arena over the last 20 to 30 years. But what they miss is the speed that technology allows for movement of people, education, and resources. So changes that used to take place in several decades will take place in 3 or 4 years. And the outsourcing issue is an excellent example. You've got to address part of outsourcing by long-term issues such as the infrastructure you build out in the country, or the education system, or the stimulus in R&D. But if you make the mistake of making decisions on compensation, and stock options are perhaps one of those, not for the executives, because candidly, and I think to be very tough on the executives is very fair, but for rank and file, you could all of a sudden dramatically speed up the outsourcing at a rate that would cause political leaders to do something unnatural with regulation that we'd all regret. So I think tying these together is very key, and the speed issue is something I think the World Economic Forum can continue to focus on. How do we educate each other on how to work together, because without that communication you can't move at the speed you need.
We want to open it up now to questions from our participants, but as you may be getting your question ready here, Marilyn raised an issue about the life cycle of CEOs and what that means in terms of leadership, Carlos, which is a point. Would you like to address that?
Yeah. Personally, I think that in a certain way, short period of time for CEO is not bad. It's not bad. I've always been saying CEOs staying for a long period of time, it's a waste. It's a waste. It's a waste of their talent or the waste of the company's opportunity. But there is a period of time after which I don't think that most of what you can give the company, you can still give it. Let me give you an example. I don't think it's a question of time, staying 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. As you know, I don't want to bring back my own story, but I found myself in 1999 heading to Japan, a country which was unknown to me, heading to head a company that was unknown to me, which was completely at the bear of collapse. It was, all the numbers were here, high level of debt, incapacity of making any profitability, bland brand, etc. And I couldn't say, look, I need 10 years to transform this company. I was barely capable to speak Japanese or understand Japanese. I knew that I had to move quickly, and I knew that I would have only one asset with me. And this is the only thing that you cannot order. This is something that you cannot legiferate. And that's what makes management in a certain way more a craft than a technique or a technology. Can you build motivation? The people inside the company, period. That's it. If you can build, and motivation inside the company is not a question, it's not going to take 5 years to build motivation. People are going to feel immediately if you feel empathy, if you have some kind of vision, if you are determined to bring the results. And they give you much more credit even than you deserve. And that's what happened. And the culture changed in a country which was completely unknown, with best practices which were completely unknown, and the changes took place in a very short period of time. So I think we have to come back to the real issue. Transparency, delivery of result. Time, frankly, doesn't change so much on it. You play on intensity. And the basic element that you need to keep in mind is the most important asset that any company has, that any country has, that any association has, is the motivation of its own people. And this is the only thing you cannot order. We can't command our people to be motivated. They give it to you or they don't give it to you. They decide. And if you get your people motivated, you're going to be very powerful. You're going to get a lot of performance. You're going to get everything back. If you can't get your people motivated, forget about everything else. And it doesn't matter if you stay 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years.
You know, one of the good things about this panel is I have tremendous respect for my colleague here, and he is a world-class leader. But most of the decisions made in my industry take 5 to 7 years to implement. And so there is the balance. There are CEOs that need to be turned over. And there's time periods when there's a new transition going on where speed is everything. But most of the decisions in terms of transforming a company, whether it's on gender or whether it's developing a new product that becomes $1 billion for me, takes 5 to 7 years, or on organization, on e-learning within the company, if I'm not going to be there for a period of time or somebody else who really believes in the same program, it's very difficult to implement the larger projects. It's like the consistency of the World Economic Forum. So this is one of those we could have a lot of fun going back and forth on.
I actually believe on that subject, though, it's very interesting. Some of the work that's been done about private companies and the returns on private companies are, according to some data, higher than the returns on public companies. Well, one of the greatest differentiators there is the continuity. So there's probably some tension between the two. Certainly fresh ideas, you know, new responses, innovation, but then that sense of continuity. So some of this, it probably enhances the probability of managing both the long and the short term.
Jim? I would say, having arrived in Switzerland 2 years ago, that I don't think that there is one model for every single company, and I think that the responsibility, has been pointed out, of the CEO is to motivate and provide leadership. And the best legacy as a CEO that I think you could lead is to leave behind an infrastructure for development and value creation for all of the stakeholders. It's the shareholders, the people, and your customers. And that is not an easy task. It's motivating people. It's making people feel good about themselves. It's getting ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And it's when you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror, you recognize the fact that everything that happened positively in that company, you had very little to do with. It was the motivation of the people. It was the excitement and how people felt about themselves. And unfortunately, everything that went wrong yesterday, you have to recognize and suck up to the fact that that is entirely what you did from that standpoint. And every situation is different. If you're in a company that is in a turnaround situation, which over the last 3 years, more companies were than not, which may account for the high rapid turnover in CEOs that you might see. I think there's a responsibility and an accountability to provide leadership and deliver. And you have to, you know, I look at this and I'm often asked, do you like living in Switzerland? I love living in Switzerland. And how long do you intend to stay here? And I'm not a fool. It's as long as I can deliver the results for my company. And once you accept that reality, then I think you can really focus on the important things.
Thank you, Jim. Let's go to questions from our participants now. One right here.
I'm Arican, Mexico. I'm a Nissan dealer. Okay. And believe me, we are very proud of what you have done. But you have been talking about transparency, respect, integrity. I only would add one thing, attitude. And I want to deliver this message. It's not the aptitude, but the attitude plus the actitude that makes the altitude.
Ooh. Yeah. Oh. Right back here, the gentleman here.
Kunruther from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. I'd like to add another stakeholder to the ones that Mr. Schiro and Mr. Kielholz have suggested with the private business and government and NGOs and the media, and that's the academic community. And I'd like to raise the question to the panel, how can we bring the academic community closer to these other stakeholders by trying to get a better understanding of the kind of data that's available, trying to do research that really addresses a lot of the very interesting problems that everyone has raised, and to try to build an element of trust among the academic researchers and the business and these other communities so that one can really go forward in this dimension that the WEF is really promoting.
Let's use the Jordanian education initiative as an example. There are 3 academic groups involved in that. And it starts with understanding what you're trying to do and then going to what we talked about earlier, going to the group that might have an expertise in that area. But it also ties back to building relationships. Coming out of this World Economic Forum, I met a number of academics, both on the panels and otherwise, that all of a sudden I realized we could do things together we couldn't do separately. So I want to congratulate the World Economic Forum on creating an environment where we can exchange, and maybe part of that process that I alluded to earlier, when we deal with issues, how do we automatically make sure it's the 6 groups, not 3 or 4 in the process?
Good. Thank you. Right here.
Thank you. I'm part of the Alliance of Spiritual Leaders that the World Economic Forum has, we are very thankful for that, brought also to be partners. And I'm trying to think, how do I translate what is happening here to students in the different schools? There has been a meeting here, and it is about trust and credibility, it's about transparency, it's about good leadership behavior, and facing climate change and other disasters of the great risks, and the alertness of the community. What is happening? How will they be motivated? And one, just as a suggestion, is the global goals of the United Nations. The goals that were set by humanity and that were judged now by the World Economic Forum to have only 3 out of 10 in performance. So it's a bad performance. So can we have an alliance, a stronger alliance of business and all the stakeholders to set this timetable? Because there is a clock. It's 2004, and we set that 135 million children who have no basic education at this moment will have basic education by the year 2015. That gender equality will be achieved. Even in 2005, it's very, very near. So to have this accountability that we talk about in a stronger way from year to year, not to have only a survey that shows how we have failed, looking in the mirror, but to have this alliance and portray that so it can be translated to the students at the schools who are eager to have perspective.
Mm-hmm. Any one of our panelists want to take that?
Marilyn?
I think that's you have essentially articulated, I think, the challenge that each of us has to go back into our own setting and to try to forge some alliances, whether they're the associations we've made here, or whether we can do similar ones that integrate the various aspects of our need to respond to the societal goals. But I would hope that you would go back, and I read a wonderful article that talked about what Klaus told the global leaders last summer. And that would be what I would like the young people to know. And that is that I find that the people I've met here and the programs that are developed here really do take into consideration the three as essential pieces of character that we find in leadership. And one is mind, which encompasses the professionalism and the ability to become expert and to have expertise, and heart, which is the passionate engagement in a cause or a service, and soul, which is a commitment to a mission and the values necessary to fulfill it. And I think that when we look at the surveys of young people and their attitudes toward all of us, whatever sector we represent here, we don't come out so very well. And I think perhaps what they need to know is that we have here in these halls been addressing issues of the mind and the heart and the soul, though not explicitly. It's implicit in the programs and the alliances that we need to build. And I hope that that understanding that whatever métier they choose, that they can bring their whole self, in fact they must, in order to be the virtuous leaders that the world needs.
Thank you, Marilyn. We have two last questions here. Right here, sir.
I'm Philippe de Buc, Secretary General of UNICE, representing the European business. We're trying to link two elements, the just-in-case mentality of Mr. Kielholz and the motivation aspect of Mr. Ghosn, and then the two clocks, the two speeds. And I think business will always go faster for all kinds of reasons than politics, because for politicians it's much more difficult. And I would ask the question to the panelists, how will we reconcile that? How will we try to obtain from the politicians that they have also a just-in-case mentality?
Personally, I'm not even so unhappy about the two speeds. I think the democratic process is based on an understanding by the large part of the population what the issues are about, and not rushing into changes. Coming from Switzerland and having experience with a fairly basic democratic process with referendums and so on, I have learned that there is value in a slower speed sometimes, because you have to have people on your agenda. If you lose them behind or let them behind, they will take revenge on you, because they feel left out, and they feel misunderstood, and they feel that one has not been taken enough time to explain them why they should now act in a certain way or another. Business has in a little bit the same problem, but the constituency is usually much smaller. It's focused on a client segment, it's focused on its employees. It's usually much more unified in a way and can act quicker, and maybe it has a role also to go ahead and show certain examples. But I'm not necessarily unhappy about the slower speed in politics.
You know, maybe to stay with that point, I think Walter was right on the money in terms of his comments, and the right word is sometimes. There's sometimes from the safety net is the politics moving slower. And the key is to identify the situation. If the situation is one like education, you can do that over a 10 or 15-year time period and set goals to achieve that. But there are other decisions that you have to make relatively quickly. Key industries and my industry get up to the top and down in 2 to 3 years. And you have to understand the employment issues, et cetera, that go with it. And I think the way you do it is to get business leaders and politicians not talking at each other, but developing the relationship, educating each other. My experience has been, regardless of political form of government or even party, if people take time to listen to each other, they make good decisions. So I think it's being able to determine which category it's in, and then both sides being willing to invest the time to educate each other and learn together when we have to move fast and when we have to move slow.
That's
Jim?
the definition of partnering.
Yes, it is.
Jim, did you want to add something?
I think it's just like an automobile or any other. You have a gas pedal and a brake, and it's just like everything else in life. It's a matter of balance, and it's striking that right balance. There are times where, in times of crisis, you have to move faster than you might ordinarily in terms of the decisions that you're making, but you also need that brake to slow you down, and so you look back and understand the unintended consequences, and you don't just rush out ahead. So I'm not totally disturbed by the disparity in the speed in which we move. I think it helps us strike the right balance.
You know, I'll make one last very quick point. Our problem is, if a government leader comes to talk to a business person or a group of business people, or a business person goes to talk to a government leader on a very important issue, and they haven't already built a trust relationship, it doesn't work. And that's why creating environments where you have a chance to get to know each other before the problem or the opportunity comes up is so key.
I learned some very interesting lessons in that regard as we were doing systems work across our entire organization. And we were looking at some major successes from transformations when we've put in systems across all the silos. And I was speaking to one young person whose eyes were alive, and they were explaining that, you know, the cost takeout, the improved productivity, the improved quality of the work. And I said, well, what did you learn? And his response was, we thought we knew the answer. If we had put the answer in when we thought we knew it, we would have made a mistake, until we analyzed the process and discovered that the outcome and the course of action was quite different after looking at taking the systemic approach. And in the end, we got to the right answer faster by taking the time to analyze the pieces, look at where the friction points were, eliminate the friction point, and perhaps there's a model in that for some of us facing these larger issues that take cross cultural and political business issues facing the infrastructure, et cetera.
The last question, right here.
Comments. Thanks very much. Sean Cleary. Can I go back to Jose Maria's introduction in respect of this? Because I think the business lessons that everyone has been expressing are absolutely fundamental, and I think that they are of enormous importance in the context of the theme of this annual meeting. If this is about partnering for security and prosperity, many of the core lessons that you've all been expressing actually need to be applied in the political landscape as well at this point in time. None of you, with great respect, none of you would even dream about setting a 15-year goal with specific metrics and then face a situation after 3 years and discover that you had a 3 out of 10 rating by the analyst and financial press. So from a practical perspective, it seems to me that if we have committed to things like Millennium Development Goals, one of the pieces of advice that we ought to be giving to the global community at this point in time is, for God's sake, build in a strategic plan to get from here to 2015, understand what metrics you need year on year, benchmark and measure, and then put the resources that are necessary to get each year's achievement in place and build on that achievement and keep moving forward. Otherwise, we're never going to put the focus, systemic or otherwise, or the resources behind achieving those goals, and then we're going to get to 2012, panic, and have to revise downwards. Now, we all know what happens at the markets to the share price if you try that sort of stunt. And realistically, I think that with the level of interconnectivity that we're experiencing in today's global environment, we've got to face up to the fact that that's what's going to be happening in political constituencies as well. We're setting ourselves up for a monumental disaster. Let's get the metrics in, let's get the plan in, let's get the benchmarks in, then we can figure out what resources we require in 2004, 2005 and onwards. Thanks very much.
Maybe José María has an answer.
No, I think we just follow the advice. Absolutely. Time to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. Philippe and I would like to thank many different stakeholders. But let me begin by our panelists, our co-chairs that have been with us from the very beginning, planning of the meeting and carrying it forward. Thank you ever so much for your responsibility and your leadership with us towards the annual meeting 2004. Thank you, Jim, for being a rapporteur and for bringing back to this event what we have been discussing about in every one of our sessions.
He did a very good condensé like Nestlé, you know, which is sweet. Would like now to thank all of you, all the participants, to come here, to have worked hard during all those days. We hope you were satisfied with what you've done, what you achieved, and we thank you for also your intellectual contribution. And we wish you a safe trip back home. We'd like to thank also our members, our partners, and all of the people who have helped us putting this program together.
You know, I think as co-chairs, we would like to thank you because you create an environment here that I think gets better and better. And in talking to a number of the participants this year, many of them felt this was perhaps the best one they've attended. So thank you for the commitment and making a difference.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.